Hello, everyone. Welcome to this competitive advantage. My name is Charles Wu. I'm a first-year student here at MIT Sloan. And today we have Daniel Altman, the founder of Northyard Analytics, and he's here to talk about how can you stop Leicester City. And I hope there's some managers in the Premier League listening to this technical advice. As an Arsenal fan, I would love to know the answer. So with that, please take it away, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to Sloan for having me. How many people know about a place called Leicester? How many people know about a place called Leicester that's not in Massachusetts? OK, good, great. All right. So Leicester City, an improbable story, supposedly, a team that was at the bottom of the English Premier League last season, mid-season, and is now at the top. So how did these things happen? And what could teams have done to prevent this from happening, this aberration? Well, it may not be so much of an aberration, and I think there are things that teams could still do. So just a quick overview of the talk. I'll start out just telling you a little bit about how I got into this and what my approach is. Then just a word about opposition analysis using data, because that's what this is. This is something that teams want to do before they face another team in their league or in a European competition or in any sort of soccer competition. Do some analysis up front, use data to try and find out the tendencies of their opponent and how they can disrupt that. And then a word about Leicester City, who I would consider the not-so-unlikely leaders of the Premier League. And finally, how to stop them, the Foxes as they're known, and whether anyone actually did. This is an important question because I actually published some hints of this research back in December. So there was plenty of time for people to learn about how to stop them. We'll see if they did. And then we'll finish with some Q&A. So where did this all start? Well, I'm an economist by training. I trained down the road a little bit at a place not called Sloan. I've been living with numbers really for 15 years as an economist in different areas, in government, consulting, academics, even in journalism. And I really feel like it took me that long to understand, have a deep feeling for probability and statistics. You know, I learned it all in school and grad school, but it takes a while to really live with it. I did some predictions back for the 2006 World Cup. That was my first foray into soccer data, and it worked out pretty well. In fact, my model started to beat Nate Silver's model, which I won't say very loudly. Yeah, I also read Soccernomics by Steven Szymanski and Simon Cooper. I read The Numbers Game by Chris Anderson and Dave Sally, and these were fantastic things to get started. Just get your mind working. So I actually bought some data from Opta, which is one of the sponsors of this event, and started playing around with it. On-the-ball data, 2,000 events per game in the English Premier League with X and Y coordinates and timing of everything. And I started to get some insights. I started to approach some teams. So now I'm serving a bunch of different clients who are interested in what happens in the game. And one of the things that I do for these clients is opposition analysis. Well, really, all opposition analysis uses data somehow, right? You got to base your observations and your predictions and your strategies on something. But what I'm trying to do is use recorded data to get a little more of a complete picture, not just what my advanced scouts have seen, not just what I've seen watching video, but get as much sort of objective data as I can. It's not completely objective because it is ultimately recorded by human beings. And my way of seeing it has biases that I'll come in with like anybody else. But try to get a little more objective by looking at really tens or hundreds of similar situations so we can observe these tendencies that teams have and try to find out how to get under their skin. So what we're going to do today is actually just one component of an opposition analysis that I would do. I would typically put out a 20-slide presentation on opposition analysis for one game, and this is really a half-hour explanation of one slide. So it gives you an idea of the breadth of stuff you can do, but today we're going to be looking at Leicester City making their fast forward attacks from deep. So starting in their own half of the field, what is it that makes them so deadly going forward? Well, first question I want to ask is, in any opposition analysis, what is the team's style, both in attack and defense? And where on the field are they strongest in attack? And then where are they weakest in defense so I can find channels to attack them? And then who are the pivotal players, either in attack or defense? And finally, how can we disrupt the things that work for them? So today, we'll be looking at the style and attack, and we'll be looking at how to disrupt that. But if you're doing opposition analysis, these are good questions to start with. So here we go, Leicester City, this Cinderella story. And a Cinderella story, in some ways, based on data. This is a success story for soccer analytics for reasons that I'll describe very soon. They certainly looked unlikely just to a casual observer. Halfway through last season, they were bottom of the Premier League. They had similar points to what Aston Villa had this season, halfway through the season, and they're pretty much on track for relegation. They had 13 points from 19 matches, or about 0.7 points per match. You get 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw. This is a poor total. And they had a low payroll relative to the Premier League leaders. We know that in the English Premier League, money talks, and money walks as well. Money does a lot of things, in fact, in the Premier League, but it usually gets you a higher finish in the table. Bigger wages, better players, better performance. The market sort of works in some ways. So they had a low payroll. But they had suffered from bad luck. If you look at the underlying performances, if you look at the number of shots they were generating, the quality of the shots, the type of ball movement they were getting, advancing the ball into the opponent's half, and the flip side of that in defense, they had been a little bit unlucky. Those underlying performances usually would have been expected to get you more points. They did sign Robert Huth halfway through the season, big defender, started his career in the Premier League with Chelsea, and he really strengthened their defense. He made a tremendous difference to their defense. They started giving up fewer goals. And in the end, they finished 14 points. In the second half, they had 1.5 points per match. So they more than doubled their point total per match in the second half of the season. And in fact, again, if we take out how unlucky they were, they would have had 1.7 points per match. So in the second half of the season, they played like a totally different team, worthy of 1.7 points per match, which is usually, if you play that way for the whole season, it's usually good enough for 5th or 6th place in the Premier League. So really, by the end of the season, they were playing like a 5th or 6th place team. That's not seeming so unlikely anymore, is it? Moreover, they had this amazing analytics department, which they still have, which was built in part by Rob McKenzie, who was their chief technical scout, who then moved to Tottenham Hotspur. His successor, Ben Wrigglesworth, then moved to Arsenal. These are good people getting poached by bigger teams. And in fact, they're so into their analytics from a tactical perspective and a recruiting perspective that they hosted their own event last month on Tactical Insights. They spent 50 million euros on new players over the summer. So they splashed the cash too, knowing that they would be in the Premier League for another season. And they brought in Claudio Ranieri, actually quite a successful and accomplished coach, even by Premier League standards, who had been the coach of Chelsea at the dawn of the Roman Abramovich billionaire era, when he finished second in the Premier League in his final season. So this was not necessarily a recipe for destruction, was it? In fact, it was a recipe for success. You take a 5th place team, a great coach, a top analytics department, add 50 million euros, you might even finish better than 5th in the coming season. Okay, anybody still feeling extremely surprised about Leicester? Good, I've done my job so far, excellent. So how do you stop these guys? And did anybody really do it? Well, let's find out what their attacking style was, looking at these deep attacks, starting in their own half. A sort of basic distinction in the Premier League is between teams that attack directly and teams that attack with build-up play. There's some teams that try and hit you really fast, shooting up the field, perhaps on a counterattack, perhaps not, running fast, passing the ball straight ahead. And there are other teams that try and build up the play. They pass it back and forth many times on the edge of the opposition's penalty area. They're looking for the entry. They're looking for that final dagger, the incisive pass that's going to put them in a good position for a shot. When you see them play, it's almost like watching an ice hockey game where you're passing it around the point to point, looking for that entry. And there are teams that do both. Crystal Palace is a team that plays pretty directly. Teams that do build-up play would include Manchester City, Arsenal, maybe Swansea. And so we see these distinctions, these two different approaches, and sometimes they're backed by different formations as well, different types of players. But what does Leicester do? Well, we're looking for this directness in the speed that they use. They want to outpace their defenders and create advantages. And we're also looking to see if they do this other thing, this patient passing to lull the defenders a little bit and find the openings. So when we're focusing on attacks from deep, in Leicester's case, we're going to be looking for these two strategies to see which one dominates, and we're going to be considering really what leads to about 1/3 to 1/2 of their goals from open play. So plays starting in the back half, the defensive half, are going to lead to a third to a half of their goals from open play. So what are they really doing in those positions? Well, how are we going to measure directness? That's the first question. And the second question is going to be, how are we going to measure how potent their attacks are? So directness, well, let's say that we're starting in our own half, where that red dot is. That could be an Arsenal player, maybe Liverpool, maybe Manchester United. And the distance to goal, in this case, is about 80 yards. Okay, so just consider that you're starting there and you've got 80 yards to go to get to the goal line, which is your destination, if you can make it. There are many ways to get there, right? You could take quite a circuitous path like this, which might be 160 yards, or 2 times the distance to goal. Or you could go more directly, fewer passes, much fewer deviations from that straight line towards the goal, and you could get to a position within about 80 yards, or 1 times the distance to goal, from which it's viable to shoot. So you can see in the middle panel there, you've got a team that's not playing very directly. They pass twice the distance to goal. And in the right-hand panel, you've got a team that's going pretty directly, because they're only going 1 times the distance to goal. So this is going to be my measure of directness. How many times the distance to goal do you pass on your way to attack? Second thing, we've got to measure the potency of these attacks, the end product. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use a standard expected goals model, a shot-based model. And this is what you heard about in the soccer analytics panel yesterday. And you may have been wondering, what is expected goals? What are expected goals? Are they singular or plural? Well, basically, they're just a way of using historical averages to predict how likely a generic shot from a certain situation and location is to score. So let's take a shot like number 1 here. This is a direct free kick. Okay, so the ball has been stopped because of a foul. Somebody's standing over the ball, ready to kick it directly towards the goal. 35 yards out, about a 30-degree angle. And you could estimate, for example, that there would be about an 8% chance of scoring. So maybe 1 in 12 of these shots would go in for a goal. So your expected goals from a shot like that in that same position and situation is 0.08. Pretty simple, right? That means in many, many repetitions of that same shot, across the league, many seasons, you're expecting on average 1 in 12 of them to go in. Well, take a different shot. This one, number 2, is a header from a corner. So somebody kicks the ball in from the corner, and there's someone in the middle of the box trying to head it. And it's 8 yards from goal. It's only a 5-degree angle. It might have a 15% chance of scoring, a much higher chance of scoring. Okay, so if you can get that situation and get your head on the ball in that situation, you might have a 0.15 chance of scoring worth 0.15 expected goals. And we can add these up to see how many goals on average we would expect teams to score from certain situations. And teams that create more of these situations would be expected to score more times. And these expected goals, because they're not as subject to the vicissitudes of luck and randomness, tend to be a better predictor of performance, at least early in the season, than regular goals are, because there's lots of randomness in soccer. So we're going to use expected goals to measure the end product. But not every one of these attacks will result in a shot. We won't always have those 0.08 or 0.15 expected goals at the end, because the team might lose the ball. So for each category of questions, of attacks, I should say, and possessions, we should ask 2 questions. One is there a shot at the end? Okay? And if there is a shot, how good a shot is it? So if we average those expected goals over all the possessions, we're going to be looking at some where there's a shot and some where there's not. So let's say we had a set of 5 possessions, all going forward in attack. 3 of them might not have resulted in a shot, but 2 of them did, for a total of 0.2 expected goals. And if we divide that by the 5 possessions, we get an average of 0.04 expected goals per possession. Am I crystal clear? This is my professorial Socratic self over here. Are we clear? Yes, excellent. Okay, very good. So now we have our measure of directness, and we have our measure of end product. So we can see, as Leicester plays, whether their most direct attacks are more successful or whether their least direct attacks are more successful. And it looks a little something like this. This may look like a mess to you, and it is. But this is just a simple scatter plot of the measure of directness on the x-axis, that's the multiple of the initial distance to goal that they're covering with their passes, and on the y-axis, the expected goals per possession. And as you can see, most of the time it's 0, because most of the time they don't get a shot. But there are many times when it's not 0. So I can use some nice mathematical tools to make this into a prettier picture. And then it looks like this. So I'm only looking up to 3 times the initial distance to goal, and I get that nice curve that you see there. In the background, where you see that histogram plot, that's the right-hand axis, the right-hand vertical axis, which is the percent of possessions. So you can see that most of their possessions do end fairly quickly. This is true for most teams. But they get a decent number that are sort of in the sweet spot there where the chance of scoring is the highest. You can see the expected goals per possession peak at around 1.25, 1.5 times the distance from goal. So that's saying that if they just go a little bit further than the initial distance to goal, that's when their chance of scoring is highest. And you can see the gray bars underneath there showing how frequently they're able to do that. So we can tell you one thing right now. You do have to pass towards the goal, right? If you're starting from 0, if you go 0 times the distance from goal, chances of scoring are pretty low. But as you get higher and higher, this is a smooth curve, so each point is not actual data, but a smooth curve. As you go further and further, the chance of scoring rises. But once you go past about 1.5 times the distance to goal, for Leicester, the chance of scoring falls. The more they pass, the less likely it is that they're going to score. So that tells you that when Leicester gets involved in build-up play, they start passing the ball back and forth the way Manchester City does or Arsenal does, they're not going to score. They have to be fast. They have to be direct. That's when they're potent. So this tells you something very specific about their style and attack starting from deep. Well, you can compare it to another team. The other leaders in the Premier League this season are Tottenham Hotspur, and they have quite a different curve. They do better when they pass more. In fact, when they go past twice the distance to goal, that's when they're at their most potent. So you can see they are more of a build-up team than Leicester. Leicester has to be direct. Well, one thing we can conclude right away is if we can slow Leicester down, then that destroys their chances of scoring. Well, how do we slow them down? If you push them to the flanks, push them out to the flanks, then they have to come back into the center of the field in order to get a good shot. That means they're passing a further distance. So if you don't let them go straight up the field anymore, you pass them to make them go to the flanks, then you're slowing them down because you're forcing them to use more distance. You're increasing that multiple the distance to goal. You're making them less direct. So that's one thing we learned right away. Second question we want to ask, though, is who makes their direct attacks go so quickly? Who is it that's getting the ball straight up the middle of the field? Who's making this happen? We need to look at all the attacks, of course, not just those that end in shots, but we want to look at who are the people who are pivotal in this. And the people who are pivotal are often the people at the beginning of the move, because order matters, right? You can't give the ball to your center forward right away because there's no one in front of him. If he receives the ball at the midfield line, all he can do is run at the defense himself, which, okay, sometimes it might work, but it's better to have other people start the attack, right? So there's a possibility of players in front of them. You want to see if your midfielders can start the attack, your defenders, maybe your wingers, and your fullbacks. The order matters, because if you can isolate the people who are starting the attacks and disrupt them, then the ball never gets to the center forward. It never gets to the winger. So you're looking for the people at the beginning. Cut that thing off before it gets any further. Well, if we look at the players who are involved in the first or second pass or dribble of each of Leicester's attacks from deep, this is what it looks like. Danny Drinkwater, number 1, he's their central midfielder. He is the crux of many of their attacks. Number 2 is Kasper Schmeichel, who's their goalkeeper, because he does a lot of long kicks out of his area. He kicks the ball straight up, looking for those fast forwards and wingers. Number 3 is N'Golo Kanté. He's another one of their central midfielders, more of a holding midfield player. And then after that, you get a couple more. But you can see that Drinkwater and Conte, these two guys who play in the center of the field, are really important here. They are the guys who are starting the majority, or not the majority, but the biggest plurality of these attacks. So if we look at the same curves, but for the players, they look like this. So these are the same curves, but the subset of attacks that have these players as the first or second pass or dribble. So in this case, we're looking at Drinkwater, Danny Drinkwater. His curve is quite similar in shape to Leicester's overall curve. And look, he's almost getting to 0.03 expected goals per possession when he passes the ball early in the move and when it is fairly direct. If we look at Conte, even higher, close to 0.04 expected goals per possession. This is really high when you consider all we said about this is that this guy is touching the ball early in the attack, and he's already got a 4% chance of scoring. That's incredible, because there are many shots that are taken that don't have a 4% chance of scoring. So these guys are passing daggers, both of them. Nobody else on the team has a graph that looks like Drinkwater or Conte's. Nobody else on the team, much flatter. And they don't get up so high to 0.03, 0.04 expected goals per possession. So most dangerous attacks are starting through the midfielders. Kind of makes sense because, as I said, if it was the forward, there'd be no one in front of him. If it's the defender, then maybe everybody's in front of him. But in Leicester's case, you certainly want to disrupt both Drinkwater and Conte. These are guys that you want to deal with. Stop them from starting these attacks. So I actually said this, and it was published thanks to James Tozer, who's in the audience, in The Economist back in December. Not in quite so much detail, but something similar, showing the directness of Leicester City's attacks and suggesting that these midfielders were important. And I wrote a blog following up with a little more detail. So what happened in matches 17 to 28 after those first 16, which I showed in The Economist? Because everything you've seen so far was just about the first 16 matches that Leicester played. All of this information was available as of the 19th of December last year. So what happened after that? The opposition was a little bit tougher. You know, if I look at strength of schedule for Leicester City, it was just a tiny bit tougher, but fairly similar overall. So let's see what happened. Well, this was the graph that you saw before. Same graph you saw before for matches 1 through 16. So think about how many good direct attacks they're getting and how successful they are. This is what it looks like in 17 to 28. So I'll go back and forth a couple times. This is before, this is after. Before, after. And you can see the curve is pretty similar, right? They're still just as effective from the most direct attacks as they were before. But if I do this again, look at the histogram now. Look at the gray bars. They're getting slightly fewer of them. They're getting fewer attacks in their sweet spot. Okay, so they're still very effective when they can be direct, but they're getting fewer. Well, let's look again in our table to see who started the attacks. Again, first or second pass or dribble of the attack. Two of your fullbacks have moved up here. Fuchs and Simpson, left back and right back, are getting more of these touches, which means maybe teams are being a little bit successful in pushing the attacks to the flanks. Maybe they read it. Oh my God, they even read The Economist. Smart guys. Look, Drinkwater and Conte, their touches have barely changed, right, as a percentage. There may be fewer of these, but the likelihood that it's going to go to Drinkwater or Conte hasn't changed that much. So they are getting the touches, but what's happening? Well, let's see how much these two guys, whom we now love so much, are getting hassled when they're on the ball. So let's look at tackles, challenges, blocks, and fouls as a percentage of the events that involve these two players. Well, in matches 1 to 16, it was about 3% to 4% of events for both of them. Matches 17 to 28, all of a sudden these guys are getting more attention. Not the good kind of attention. But now they're getting the kind of respect, in a way, that you would expect a good player to get. Santiago Cazorla, well-known, excellent central midfielder, Spanish international for Arsenal, gets pressed in about 4.8% of events. So now they're paying attention to Drinkwater and Conte as much as they pay attention to Cazorla, and this warms my heart. So they did get hassled more. But what did it really result in? Well, we know they were still pretty prolific in getting those touches, but they were less effective. Drinkwater missed a couple matches, which were both losses if you look just at expected goals from open play. So missing Drinkwater is a big miss. But if we look again at all those possessions starting from the defensive half, the shots that they got per game from those possessions fell by 50%. So those guys are getting the ball, but they're also getting hassled a lot more, and their ability to create shots fell by half. But the expected goals from these possessions only fell by 25%. What does that tell you? Induction, it tells you that they were better shots, the ones that they got. Fewer shots, a lot fewer, but the ones that they did get were better. So if you press these guys, it has a cost, right? You're committing players to press the midfielders. That means there are fewer people to defend elsewhere on the field. So it makes sense that the shots that do get through would be better shots. But overall, this was worth it. Because overall, you reduced the expected goals from these possessions by a quarter. Not as much as you would reduce the shots, but heck, isn't it worth it to reduce the expected goals from these possessions by a quarter? So I think this is a success for opposition analysis. As I said, it's only one component of opposition analysis, but I'm comfortable saying that this is something that teams could have done to improve themselves against Leicester. Now, as you know, Leicester are still in first place. But their expected goals have gone down, and they have been a little bit lucky along the way. So if they do end up as champions, they can count Lady Luck as one of their fans. And now I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much. Somebody with the microphone is circulating.
You mentioned that they spent like £50 million in the summer, which is a large
Euros.
amount. But at the same time, you could argue that their two most important players were Vardy and Mahrez, neither of whom cost anything and were pretty irrelevant to, I don't think other teams were looking at them. So how do you think their scouting department influenced that, in that they may have spent money, but they spent it very well?
So I think that you can look at the money they spent over summer, but you have to look at the money they spent before that too. They were finding players in, let's say, the second division in France. Why would they find players in the second division in France? Well, Opta, which collects all this really detailed data, happens to give full coverage of the second division in France. So if you have an algorithm that works in the Premier League to spot players, you can use it in the second division in France too. And that's where you can pick up a player like a Conte or a Mahrez, perhaps. But anyway, Conte came over this season with that transfer window, with that money. So he was one of the buys. And some of the other guys, like the wingers, who helped to distract the defenses and pull players wide so that you can push play up the middle, were also part of that. So I think it's all part of the package. But their technical scouting has been going on for a few years now. It's not just what happened over that summer. Another question.
Hello. Down
Yes,
here.
I see you.
I'm wondering if you have analyzed goals scored from transition, because it's harder to close down players, when you're out of balance.
So the question is whether I've analyzed goals scored from transition, and the answer is yes, but I can't talk about it. Sorry.
So for the region of, possessions where the distance passes between 0 and 1, that's implying that obviously the ball is being run more. So Leicester is known as like a faster team. Does their, production during that region, is that a lot higher than other?
Is there production during what, sorry?
During the region between 0 and 1 in terms of, distance covered by passes. Is that higher versus other teams?
So the question is about Leicester in their production between 0 and 1 times the distance to goal. Is it better than other teams? Yes, marginally. But one thing that's important to realize about Leicester is that they're not just busting their lungs as they run forward all the time. If you look at the outlet passes in the middle third of the field, and then runs that follow that forward. So this is the classic counterattacking sort of situation. Take possession in the middle of the field and then bomb forward. They actually have the fewest runs of any team in the league. They let the ball do the work. So they are fast, but it's because of the precision passing. It's not so much because of the running. Okay, another question. Yes?
So your analysis talked about expected value from shots, but just like anecdotally watching soccer, there can be times when the ball's in a very dangerous position, but no shot is taken, but that would still technically count as a 0 for you. Do you feel like your analysis of shots takes that into account, or is that something you would want to add?
It doesn't take it into account. He's asking, what happens if you get the ball into a very dangerous position, but there's no shot? Do we count that? I have another model for that. I invented something called a ball progression model, which bases expected goals. Again, it's an expected goals model, but on how far you got the ball up the field, into how dangerous a position. So if you get the ball 30 yards from goal, there might be a 2% chance that all possessions going through that position would end in a goal. But if you get it to 15 yards from goal, then there might be an 8% chance. So the guy who moves the ball from 2% chance to 8% chance is worth 0.06 expected goals to you. So if you use a shot creation model like the one I showed here with a ball progression expected goals model, you can see how efficient teams are at turning ball movement into shots. A team may have 2 expected goals worth of ball movement and only 1 expected goal worth of shots. That means that they're moving the ball forward, they're doing well, but they're not turning it into shots. And that's a problem that Chelsea, for example, had in the first half of the season. They had great ball movement forward. Eden Hazard gets the ball, but then everybody knows Eden Hazard has the ball. So everybody marks the guys who could get a shot off, and there's no shot. So if we use those 2 models together, you can suss out that aspect of the game. I think that's it, actually. We're out of time. So I'm happy to meet people afterwards out in the hall, but thank you very much for your attention.